Hello, welcome to today's EphMRA webinar in our Young Researchers Program series. Our topic today is projective techniques. The webinar consists of two parts. Firstly, the presentation, and then afterwards a question and answer session. You can make comments or ask questions at any time using the Ask a Question tab on the left-hand side, which stays live throughout the webinar. Your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation while not revealing your identity. A PDF version of these slides and a recording will be available for EphMRA members on the EphMRA website in the next week. I'm your host today. My name is Anhua Lee. I'm Director at Research Partnership and have over 14 years experience in the healthcare and consumer market research. I'm a member of the EphMRA Learning and Development Committee since 2015. I'm delighted to introduce today's presenter, Emily Braund, who is an Associate Director at Research Partnership. Emily is a French native and holds a diploma in health engineering. She has since gone on to build up 14 years of experience in international pharmaceutical market research with expertise across qualitative and quantitative methodologies, including exploratory depth research with physicians and patients in multiple therapy areas. Now, please, Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Anhua, for the introduction. So today we will be looking at 4 different parts around the projective techniques. First of all, I will explain what projective techniques are, why we use them in market research. Then we will be discussing considerations around when to use them. After that, we'll discuss tips on how to use them effectively. And finally, we'll review case studies before moving on to Q&A, as mentioned by Anhua. So, what are projective techniques? It's a technique that helps respondents to express their own views and motivations. So, they generally fall into 3 categories: associations or analogy. For example, if Coca-Cola was an animal, which animal would it be? It could be in the group of personification. So, if Coca-Cola was a person, what type of person would they be? Or they could be expressive, when we're asking respondents to imagine, for example, here that they are a lawyer defending Coca-Cola's new offering in court. What case would the respondent put forward in its favor? It's really important is to keep in mind that the projective technique is a means to an end, and not an end in itself. So the important thing about the range of techniques that we'll be discussing and covering here today is to understand why and what it means to respondents, what it stands for. So you might be asking yourself, why not just asking the respondent directly? Well, projective techniques, the use of projective techniques is underpinned by two theories, one based on psychology and the other one based on behavioral economics. So if we start by looking at the psychology theory, as Sigmund Freud put it, responses to stimuli are not random. Individuals are often unaware of their subjective states, and they ascribe or project inner beliefs and feelings onto various objects and people. Fantasy really facilitates the expression of the repressed ideas and feelings. Now, if we look at the projective techniques from a behavioral economics point of view, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky said that humans do not always make optimal decisions. Routine decisions are made automatically and quickly, with little and no effort and no sense of voluntary control. Willingness to take risks is influenced by the way in which choices are framed, and so they are context dependent. So giving you a bit more information on the theory behind projective techniques, we see that what is accessible through direct questioning can be sketched in a Johari window, and Donald Rumsfeld tried to explain this Johari window in simple terms. He said, as we know, there are known knowns, and these are the things that we know we know. Secondly, we also know there are known unknowns. That is to say that we know there are some things we do not know. And then thirdly, there are also unknown unknowns. The things we don't know, we don't know. So what does it look like in this Johari window itself? On the vertical axis here, you have two categories, what is known and what is unknown to others. And on the horizontal axis, you have what is known and unknown to self, to oneself. So let's start with the open quadrant of the window. The open is, I know what I know. Now moving on to a blind spot. So in the blind spot, it's known to others, but unknown to self. So I don't know what I know, but others might know it. The third quadrant here is the hidden quadrant. Things are known to self, but unknown to others. So I know what I don't know. And then we move on to the unknown. And here, it's really about I don't know what I don't know. So let me explain a little bit more about each of these quadrants to you. Let me tell you more about this. The idea is that projectives can help us access feelings and motivations which respondents don't or can't easily express. So first of all, when we look at the open quadrant, so these are the public feelings. Those are accessible through direct questions. They represent the spontaneous, the rational, the reasoned information that is easily accessible to the respondent. And direct questioning and enabling techniques will only lead to more evocative description and explanations. Then we have the private feelings. These things we don't want to reveal. So these are accessible to one person's consciousness, but they are kept private by mechanisms such as stereotyping or impression management. And that's when it's become important to create a safe, trusting, accepting, and non-judgmental environment to express these feelings, using projection and a gentle challenging from the moderator. The barrier for the respondents here is the feeling that if they tell us, we won't like them and we will judge them. So to set this up, there's no hard or fast rule between exploring private feelings, whether it's in depth or groups. With patients, groups can be very useful, can be a very good setting as it helps normalize their feelings. But you also have to think about the approach you're taking in the context of the decision you're asking the respondents to explore. So for example, payers might not want to talk about their negotiation strategies in a group setting. Moving on to the next quadrant, here we're looking at intuitive associations. There are things that are difficult to verbalize. So intuitive or symbolic, or maybe even cultural associations, are either things people don't know they know, or they are not consciously analyzing them. So they will need cues to open up associations, providing verbal or visual vocabularies to help respondents notice and verbalize what is inside them. And usually symbolic material comes through imaginative tasks, while the cultural associations will come from analysis of assumptions. The greatest barrier here for respondents is that they can't express it or they don't consider it to be important. Then the last quadrant, the unconscious or repressed thoughts. Those are feelings and desires that may be troubling for the respondent. They are unlikely to emerge during market research. And really, it often needs a skilled therapeutic setting and may not be ethical or useful, at least not in an hour. To a certain extent, extended workshops might get closer to repressed feelings and motivations, but in an hour, you're very unlikely to get to the subconscious part of this. So these projective techniques here really help us to tap into the private feelings and the intuitive associations. There are the two quadrants here that have been highlighted in blue. So what are we trying to do with projective techniques? We want to access non-rational and latent thoughts and feelings, because respondents can't or don't always express what they really think or feel. So we're really trying to go beyond rational to deeper emotional motivations. We're trying to encourage creative and blue sky thinking. And also, we're trying to counter professional or evasive answers. So let's look at a few techniques in detail. The next section of this presentation, this webinar, I will talk you through a certain number of projective techniques. Let's look at our first group of projective techniques, analogy and personification. The idea here is to enable the respondent to talk about the subject with greater fluency. It's about enabling and elicitation. So first of all, we've got the analogy and metaphor. It can be animals, cars, and flowers. Those are the classics. But you can really consider updating them drawing from everyday experience. For example, if it were a tattoo, what type would it be? If it were a mobile phone, what kind would it be? So really, there's room to be more creative here. And then the second part is personification. So imagine this brand as a person. Can you describe its characteristic and lifestyle? There's three different variations I will present here to you today. Let's start with a brand party. Brand party is really useful to explore the competitive landscape and trying to understand how would all the competitive brands behave at a party. Who would be dancing wildly? Who would be sitting in the kitchen? Who would be staring out of a window? What car would they arrive in? Who do they like, don't like? This type of exercise and brand party can also be adapted in emerging markets. If house parties, for example, are less common, you can always use a brand banquet. And this is not just one question, it's really a build with lots of probes. Obviously, it will be critical to understand the why, but you have to be very careful about when you ask why. For this sort of technique to really work, you need to allow the respondent to get into the zone, to start enjoying it, and really you need to try to avoid instantly asking them to explain what they're saying. So it's really crucial not to immediately challenge and question the respondent. Another alternative here is the obituary. What should you write in an obituary for this brand? This is really useful with brands that receive a lot of negative criticism or have very limited differentiation. The idea is that obituaries tend to focus on the positive achievements. And then as a third example here, our school report or appraisal. What are the strengths and weaknesses? What are the must-try harder areas of the brand? The good moderators have all of these techniques up their sleeve, so that if a conversation hits a brick wall, they can use one other technique to help the respondent verbalize their thoughts. I know that given the lengthy need for approval of the material of our guides and questionnaire, you can consider putting more techniques into the guide than you would use, and then add instruction to the moderator to use the most appropriate technique given the respondent and the setting. That way you cover all grounds. Let's look at other techniques that will help us to enable and elicit the respondent's feeling. So we have here association and expressive techniques. First of all, the image sort or selection, which is a very classic projective technique you may have come across. Picture sort can be done from ready-made deck or free-form by the respondents. The idea is to instruct respondent not to think while doing it, and to choose the pictures intuitively and rationalize later. And I think with this instruction, it's really important to clarify that up front. This technique can be very powerful, since you all know that a picture tells 1,000 words. They can be used for four main purposes. They can give new and creative insights into brands and organizations. They're also very useful to discriminate between outwardly similar brands. They also give insight into personal motivations and cultural norms. And they can also be used to understand emotional connections, which come out as the respondent describes the image. If you are using a ready-made deck, you have to avoid pictures of people, because doctors will often select images of patients. And ensure that you have a wide variety of images, as it's not the image itself that is so important, but what it means that's important. If you do have time, what is really good is to ask the respondent to rip out the pictures from magazines or to look up images online or in advance. Then moving on to the word associations and completion techniques. The idea is to ask respondents to pick 2 or 3 words which they feel best reflect the brand. You can use a fixed list. What's also key here is to remember to allow them to choose any other words as well. This way you can broaden the range of words and adjectives. There are 3 different variations for this technique here. First of all, the sentence completion. It can also be a series of sentences. For example, I don't prescribe product X because this and that. Or you could use the mad, sad, glad exercise. You may have heard about it. And asking respondents, what makes you feel mad about this brand or about this therapy area? What makes you feel sad about it? What makes you feel glad about it? Another variation is the storytelling. So, for example, you're asking respondents to imagine that Dr. Smith has just qualified and started prescribing product X. Asking them to tell you the story of how that happened. So the idea here is to elaborate a story from a simple scenario related to a brand, without focusing just on the respondent's experience. It's about projecting. So how did Dr. Smith get there? You can also use these in future projections for new brands. For instance, imagine that in the future, product X is being prescribed by a majority. What would have to happen? What would the respondent have had to hear? What would have the majority have had to hear, see, feel for this to happen? What have the reps said? What has changed within the hospital to make it happen? The third variation here is the guided imagery. These need to be carefully set up. The respondents are asked to close their eyes while the moderator guides them on an imaginary journey through space, from leaving Earth in their space capsule all the way to returning again at the end of the expedition. They are asked to think deeply about the experiences and emotions associated with visits to planet brand X. The questions, for example, could be, what does it look like? What are the people like? What are the buildings like? How do you feel? How do you see? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? Where do you go? Who do you talk to? What do they say? How do you feel about spending 6 months here? And then the group, if we're in a group setting here, can make notes and debrief with the moderator and with each other at the end of the technique. Let's look now at how to get respondents to express socially undesirable views. The idea is to project a disowned part of the self onto a third party or an object. First technique here is bubble diagram. You might have heard it under a different name, which is semantic perception test, SPAT. The idea here is to annotate an image. Typically, it would be to elaborate a dialogue between patients and physicians, but it could be between consumers, brands, it could be between a consumer and a brand, or between brands themselves. And we ask each of these two characters, so you have two characters on this page with two speech bubbles. What does this character say? So what does a patient say? What does a physician say? And then thought bubbles. What does the patient think? What does the physician think? This way, socially undesirable views are then seen as coming from the people in the cartoons rather than from the respondents themselves. It becomes much easier for respondents to express things that they would not want to be associated with. The other technique here is second positioning techniques and role play. They can be very simple, just asking a physician to imagine a colleague who treats patients in a different way and asking them to explain why they might. So, for example, we've spoken to some other physicians like yourself, and they've told us that they would consider product X in patients like this. Why might they do so? And by setting up a specific scenario, the respondents are really encouraged to explore and explain an alternative point of view, which also helps them to articulate why they do not have this approach themselves. It's worth thinking about a very gentle version of this, and that can work very well in emerging markets. If there's a risk that patient may feel intimidated or challenged by direct questioning about a personal or sensitive topic, so maybe a topic that's more taboo in these markets, for example, women discussing menstrual problems or women's health. That might be the case, especially in these emerging markets, more so than some mature markets. So in this circumstance, the use of simple second positioning techniques can help ensure that we gather rich and honest insights. And that would really allow women to project their feelings and put themselves in the shoes of other women. And then all of a sudden, they would become much more encouraged to talk about what they believe women like them experience. And it takes the focus away from them personally and helps them relax and open up. So there's two different examples and variation. One of it is de Bono's hat, which is a great second positioning task. The idea is to ask respondents to consider a perspective on a product that is different from their own. And it's a very good tool that can be used in brainstorm to assess ideas or facilitate a meeting. And you ask respondents to mentally wear hats or switch hats. And by doing so, you can easily focus and redirect thoughts, the conversation or the meeting. So you've got 6 hats that you're asking respondents to take in turn, or that you attributed to each specific respondent in a group setting, for example. So you have a white hat, which calls for information known or needed. It's the facts, just the facts. Then you have a yellow hat, which symbolizes brightness and optimism. Under this hat, the respondent will have to explore the positives and probe for value and benefit. The black hat is judgment, the devil's advocate. Why something may not work. It really helps to spot the difficulties, dangers, and barriers where things might go wrong. It's probably the most powerful hat and useful of the hats, but it can become a great problem if it's overused. So if that's the case, I guess you can always ditch the black hat and focus on the other hats. You also have a red hat, which signifies feelings, hunches, and intuition. When using this hat, respondents can express emotions, feelings, and share fears, likes, dislikes, loves, and hates. So it's all about the feelings. Then the green hat focuses on creativity, the possibilities, the alternatives, and new ideas. It's an opportunity for respondents to express new concepts and new perceptions. And finally, the blue hat. This one is used to manage the thinking process, so it's the control mechanism that ensures the 6 thinking hats guidelines are observed. It's really fun exercise to do in a group setting if you have the opportunity. Another variation is a marketing manager, which you may have come across already. where we're asking respondents to imagine that they were in charge of marketing for a brand. How would they describe the brand? The idea here is that one group can present to another and the other can challenge, or maybe if it's a duo, one respondent can present to another. If it's a one-to-one setting, then the moderator will challenge. And the idea is to base the discussion on everything that they've heard so far. So it's a good way to identify objections and to create objection handlers for the rep communication, but also to understand how to frame the product's unique selling point succinctly to a physician. So this is a really good tool to use when developing sales aid, and you can give the respondent messages and pens and magazines to build story or the story flow. This technique can be used as a summary at the end of an interview, but it can also be the center of a discussion. And then you also have war games. In this setting here, you would split the group into two teams, each representing the marketing team for competitor brands, and you ask them to react to each scenario. So now that we've reviewed a certain number of techniques, I would like to discuss and to explain how and when to use them. So when is it best to use a projective technique? Well, you have to consider your objectives and the practicalities of it. So there are a certain number of questions that you need to address. First of all, how will it answer your objectives? Does the client understand the reason and the outputs? And how will you analyze the results? Then, what setting will the respondents be in? Is it a one-to-one or is it a group? Are you talking to patients or to physicians? Is there some cultural consideration to bear in mind? And then, how much time do you have? You need to allow time for setup and for everybody to feedback. Then, it's important to consider the type of information you are seeking. So, as I mentioned, really, the projective techniques will help you tap into the private feelings and the intuitive associations mainly. So if what you're interested in is finding out private feelings, then sentence completion, bubble drawing, personification, school reports, obituaries, all of these are the right techniques for you. However, if you're interested in understanding the intuitive association, then probing and elaboration, and laddering, for example, storytelling, role play, and guided imagery are the techniques to use here. Then it's worth noting that for public feelings, you can use picture or word association if you have time. Those are nice to have. However, it also could be used just as a backup because you can just ask the question directly. So it really depends on the moment and the circumstances. And all of these techniques have to form a toolbox to draw from. What about when to use them exactly in the discussion flow? So you may have already come across this model for how energy flows during a group, or even in-depth interviews. The key is to choose the right time, when the respondents feel comfortable and when they are receptive. The idea is that projective should be introduced once the respondents have warmed up and that trust has been built up. And in groups, when the group has started to work well together. So it's usually during the performing stage. Out of all of this, forming, storming, norming, the forming stage is the best stage to introduce a projective technique. At this point, individual needs are subservient to the group, and roles are flexible and task-orientated. So that's when respondents are most concentrated, have the greatest energy, and are most likely to work together. It's worth noting that in emerging markets, you may need to spend a bit longer with the warm-up questions. as these kind of questions are not as common and people tend to respond more rationally. However, there's really no reason why projective techniques will not work in these markets. It's also worth noting that trying techniques that don't work can ruin rapport, so the moderator needs to use their judgments and intuition about precisely when to use them in each interview. They should pick a technique and put it in the right place for the respondent, but don't just do all of the techniques at once. You need to allow the respondent to speak and to think. These are aids to vocalization. They are not just the end in itself. Let's look at top tips on setting up a projective technique before we move on to case studies. Prepare respondents from the start using clear and concise instructions. For example, we are going to be looking at many aspects of a product in many ways. Nice way to introduce a projective technique. It's also very useful and very important that respondents explain their own work, as it enables the moderator to maintain a non-judgmental stance, and it involves the respondents. The best practice is to ask respondents for comments on the exercise and what they learned from it, and to use this to stimulate further discussion within the group. Then, obviously, we want and we try to find out why, but not why. But try to ask why in other ways. So, for example, what is important about that? Then we also want to create an atmosphere of gentle curiosity and playfulness. And that will rely on you, on the moderator, how comfortable they are. And so it's important that the moderator is confident, positive, and relaxed. No stopwatch, no inspections, no right or wrong answer. Most important of all, do not apologize for the exercise. Make sure it's introduced properly. We want to say, we're going to do something a little creative now. What we definitely not want to hear when we introduce a projective technique is, I'm going to make you do something that might be a little awkward, but please go with it. Obviously, these two ways of introducing projective technique will set the technique in two very different paths. And yes, sometimes the technique fails to work with some groups or people, even with thorough preparation. But most moderators have a toolbox of techniques, and if one doesn't work, simply go with another. So far we've looked at the theory behind the projective techniques, we've reviewed a certain number of techniques, and then we looked at how to implement them. Now I would like to move on to case studies. I would like to talk you through two case studies to give you a bit more richness and depth on how it can be used and what you can get out of it. In this first case study, we use analogy and metaphor. And it's about how an analogy helped understand the emotional journey of alopecia areata patients and carers. So the client objective here was to understand the patient journey, to identify the leverage points where to provide an improved patient experience. To do so, the methodology we used was an online community with patients and caregivers. And we asked respondents to complete an image association exercise to better understand the emotional burden of AA. So the way we set up a projective technique was this way. We said, I would like you to complete quite a fun creative exercise. I would like you to think of your alopecia as it is now in its moderate to severe form. If you think about it, what would it be? Please describe it in at least 2 paragraphs why you have chosen these animals or this animal to represent your moderate to severe alopecia areata. And we also offered the respondent an alternative, and we said, if you find this difficult, you can use another object, celebrity, TV, or film personality. The benefit of this technique and what we got out of it was really rich verbatim visual output that enabled the team to immerse themselves in the life of the patients. We also got a very in-depth understanding of the emotions associated with AA, and that really helped us to uncover the private feelings of the patients. And from a client's point of view, they were able to develop a communication strategy and patient support program that was very aligned with the patient's emotional journey. So this is the output of this exercise here, looking at what AA represents to patients and its impact. So for patients, each represents a burden, and you can see all of these creepy crawly images and the loss of control. And the impact on the patient's emotional journey is a constant anxious state, and you can see here the predator images. Poor self-esteem with this poor little puppy here, and little confidence with these animals that shy away, are timid, and try to run away and want to hide all the time. So very nice and rich output here. The second case study here is around personification and a brand party. It's about how emotional insights helped build a differentiating global brand for metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. The challenge and the client objective was to create a credible global brand position for treatment in mCRPC, and to understand both the rational and the emotional association with specific brands impacting the physician's decision-making behavior. The methodology we used here was qualitative tele-depth interviews with oncologists. And the way we set up a projective technique was this way. So we asked the respondent, I'd like you to imagine that you are hosting a party, and the guests at your party were the different treatment options for mCRPC. Think first about product A. So here you can put the brand that you're interested in. Imagine product A, the person who has come as a guest to your party. What sort of person would product A be? How old would they be? What's their gender? What personality? What kind of entrance would product A make when they enter the party? How would they behave at the party? And how would they feel about how would the respondent feel about having product A at your party? The outcome and the benefit of this technique was to get a very good in-depth understanding of both the rational and the emotional association with each brand. And from the client's perspective, well, they were able to roll out an effective communication campaign highlighting differentiating factors of their sets. So here you can see product A described as an older, mature man, very sociable, charismatic, air of confidence, however, a little bit arrogant, but leaning towards being old-fashioned. And you've got a couple of great quotes here describing this product A. And all of a sudden, from a factual product, scientific, product, medical product, you have a personality attached to it. You can really project it as it really helps position the brand much better. On the other side, you've got product B, which is represented as a younger female trying very hard, the unsung heroine here, really, but she's also a little bit nervous and anxious, and she has a tendency to be very tenacious. So you can really look at both of these brands now from, you start the research thinking that there's very little differentiation in these two brands. And through this brand party exercise, you can really see very clear different personality coming out of each of these brands. To finish this webinar, this presentation here, I would like to summarize the benefits of projective and enabling techniques. And the idea here is these helps keep respondents engaged with the research issues. It enables them to articulate more creatively what they are aware of. It also sheds light on what was previously intuitive and inexpressible. Projective techniques really encourage the sharing of private and unacceptable thoughts, uncovering hidden emotions, and they also bring to light the cultural codes that frame behavior. They can illuminate how people think as well as what they are thinking. And personally, I really think that their true value lies in the interpretation and the insight they bring when respondents interpret their own work and use the new insight to stimulate further discussion. So I think overall it brings richness, depth, color, and nuance. It really helps understand complex and irrational processes. It's a meaningful way of working with abstract constructs, and it really helps to find discrimination between outwardly similar brands, products, or services. So what I would like to do now is to move on to the Q&A session. That was all of the insight I wanted to share with you.
Hi, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Emily, very much for your presentation on projective techniques. And as you say, we have some time now for some questions from the audience. So it seems like there is one that's come up by a couple of different people that seems of interest. So how do you handle difficult respondents? You know, how are you able to engage them? And especially seems like when you think of healthcare professionals, physicians, are they a easier or more difficult audience to conduct projective techniques with versus patients or consumers?
So I think, yes, physicians may be slightly harder respondents to use projective techniques with than consumers and patients. However, it's really not impossible. And I think the key here is setting the projective technique and framing it properly. And that is really important to find the right time, so to give time for the respondents or physicians, especially to warm up, to get into the swing of a discussion, and to find the right time, but also to set up the technique properly. So to be positive about it, to introduce it properly, to give them the right instructions, and also provide some example with consumer goods, for example. So it's really important to give them a couple of examples so that they really understand what we're trying to get at. So, for example, we could say, if it was for Coca-Cola, I would say that blah, 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 blah. If it was for another brand, maybe a car brand, you could use different things. I think the other thing to think about is offer different options and alternatives and keep those in your sleeve. If one doesn't work, then another one might resonate better with a different physician or a different respondent.
Great, thank you. I hope that answered the question. I've got another one here. How do you convince clients to use projective techniques in the interviews? I think it sounds like they might have had some issues in convincing clients, especially in the pharma industry, to utilize projective techniques. So how do you convince them?
Yes, that's an interesting one. I guess it's much more frequent in the fast-moving consumer goods industry to use these projective techniques than in pharma industry. However, I think, especially with the rising importance of behavioral economics, projective techniques are becoming very useful and a crucial part of market research, and really helps tap into these non-rational decisions. And I think it's about explaining to the client and to focus the discussion on the benefits for them and how it will address the business objectives, and ideally providing examples of what you've done in the past on different projects and how it helped them. Usually they are quite, they do hear it, and it resonates with them. Once you explain to them what would be the benefits, so for instance, it could be about helping them to differentiate brands and how a specific technique will help them differentiate brands. So, for example, this case study differentiates between two brands, or better understanding the non-rational, the emotional journey of a patient and how they can align their communication strategy with that. So I think it's really a matter of focusing on the objectives of a client and linking it back to this.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question here from the audience, which is about the analysis of projective techniques. So what you get out of, what you get from the responses. So here's an example. So if when you're using the animal analogy exercise and someone would describe them as a tiger or lion, so how do you kind of translate that into, you know, what it actually could mean? Do you use, you know, differences kind of from the real world of what tiger, lion could mean? Or do you, how do you interpret the results?
Okay. Well, I think here it's really about making sure that your moderators ask the right questions. So you see, we don't want to stop at just the image of a lion, of a tiger. It's all about the why. So it's beyond the image itself. It's really understanding what does the respondent mean by a tiger or lion. And also, you've got to be aware that for different cultures, a lion or a tiger might mean different, for different people and different markets, it may mean different things. So it's much more about grouping the reasons why they selected these animals or images rather than the image itself. And that's what will give you the depth. It's not so much about grouping that many respondents said tiger, that many said lion or turtle. It's really about grouping the themes that come behind these images, regardless of the image, if you wish.
I guess that also, you know, reflects of what you said, that the exercises are essentially interchangeable. If animals doesn't work for one person, cars might work better. It's all about what's behind that and what it means, as opposed to saying X number of people mentioned lion, or, you know.
Exactly. So that's why it's really useful, and moderators should be able to swap methodology and swap images, for example, depending on respondents and depending on markets, and that will not that should not create a barrier to the analysis of the results, because you will not be looking at the images themselves, but more about the meaning behind these images or these associations.
Great. I have another one here, which is with regard to kind of how universally applicable projective techniques are across cultures and markets. So are there any markets where you may not recommend using projective techniques, and or how would you also negotiate rejection of a method during an interview?
I mean, I would say that projective techniques can be used in all markets, really, and we've used them in emerging markets without any problem, whether it's in some of the Asian markets or MENA, and I think, again, it's really a matter of gentle moderation, gentle probing and challenging, and I think actually it can help them even more, especially the positioning when we project onto another person. It can help them unblock these problems, these cultural problems that we may have associated with some of these thoughts. So it's really, I think, about using the right tool for the right objectives and in the right market. So animals work well, even in some of these emerging markets, but equally you could be using car brands, or it can be around sports player. And again, it's a matter of the moderator adapting a little bit. For example, the example, when you say if it was Coca-Cola, you could use a local brand to make it more relevant for emerging markets. So I think it can really be used in all markets.
Okay. I think there is one more question I've got here from the audience. This is whether there is any type of project or objective that is particularly suited where you could use projective techniques.
I've got some in mind. I would say that market understanding, when we need to understand brand perception, whether it's through SWOT analysis, differentiation, and also trying to understand the emotional side of brands. So in this type of objective, that could be really useful. I would say also any study where we try to understand drivers and barriers for specific behavior. So when we're trying to understand the rationale and the emotional association with a specific brand or in the treatment choice. Also when we're trying to identify differentiating attributes, so to get an understanding of the market landscape or to develop a communication campaign. So whether it's really about differentiating two brands that seem very similar. So it could be for positioning, for message testing in this context, and looking at differentiating brands that can be really useful. I've also used it in terms of customer portraits, trying to understand users versus non-users. And finally, I guess when we're trying to get respondents to develop communication test campaign, so when the client wants to develop communication campaign, and we're asking respondents to take this position, for example, as a marketing manager, to develop something new or different for a product. But there's probably many other objectives that can be addressed with projective techniques. Those are the main ones I've got top of mind.
Okay, so it sounds like they are, they have a broad application in qualitative research.
Absolutely.
Great. I think there are no more questions from our audience. So thank you very much again, Emily, for this interesting presentation. And that's it for today's EphMRA training on projective techniques. So at the end of this session, you will be taken automatically to a short online evaluation of the webinar. And we hope that you complete this short survey, as we need your feedback in order to continually improve our webinars. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.